Here we have Dr. Hillel Gemara. Mazid also shoygig. The Gemara is discussing the specs, the parameters of when a Kohen HaMashiach brings a par Kohen HaMashiach. So the classic case, the textbook case, is if he made a Horios to himself, b'shoygig, and he followed that Horios. So he passed on that chelev was mutter, a type of chelev was mutter, and he ate chelev. So if it was mazid versus shoygeg, then it wouldn't be a chiyuv of the parent kohen Mashiach. The rules of when a par kohen Mashiach is brought, it mirrors that of the par helam davar shel tzibur, harei Mashiach tetzibur. All right, well, I didn't. Maybe we could have known this, that the par kohen Mashiach has the same rules as a par helam davar shel tzibur. Maybe we could have known it from a memotzinu. Turning on to Dav Zayin Amar Aleph, Tzibur moitze miklal yochid. We know a tzibur does not have the same halacha of a korban as a yochid, because a yochid brings either a seir or kaspa if he does an avera, but a tzibur brings a par helam davar shel tzibur. U'Mashiach moitze miklal yochid, and the par kohen Mashiach, a kohen, does not have the same halacha as an yochid that brings a korban. So since they have that similarity, let's suggest ma tzibur ein chayovin ella al helam davar. Just like the tzibur will not be chayiv their special korban unless there's a helam davar im shiggas ma'isa. There has to be a psak of bezdin that mistakenly was matir something, which was then followed by a ma'isa that Klal Yisrael did in following the halacha of the bezdin. Af Mashiach, so too, in order for a kohen to bring a par kohen Mashiach, lo yehi chayiv ella al helam davar im shiggas ma'isa. And if that was the case, then we wouldn't need a pasuk. But there might be another approach which would not lead us to the same conclusion. Nosi moitzi miklal yachid. A nosi does not bring the same korban as a yachid. Because a yachid brings a sira or a kaspa, and the nosi, if he has to bring a chatas, only brings a seir. So he brings a male seir rather than a sira or a kaspa. So nosi moitzi miklal yachid, u'Mashiach moitzi miklal yachid, and par kohen Mashiach is also not like a yachid. Ma nosi maybe b'shugas ma'isa b'loy helam davar. A nosi, if he does a chet b'shoygeg, he brings the korban even though there's no psak. It's based on merely doing a shugas ma'isa, which is like a standard shoygeg. He mixes up chaylev with shuman, thinks he's eating shuman when he's actually eating chaylev. There was no psak that preceded it. So maybe af Mashiach, maybe b'shugas ma'isa b'loy helam davar. Maybe compare the kohen Mashiach to a nosi, and no psak is required. A simple shoygeg is what triggers the special korban of the nasi. Maybe a simple shoygeg triggers the special korban of the kohen Mashiach. Let's see what a kohen Mashiach is more similar to, which we should compare it to. Should we compare it to the par kohen, to the par helam davar shel tzibur, or should we compare it to the nasi? So zok to Gemara, tzibur bepar. The korban helam davar shel tzibur is a par, similar to the par kohen Mashiach, which is also a par, and the ein mevin asham tali. A rabbim never brings an asham tali. So a tzibur brings a korban of a par, and a tzibur never brings an asham tali. U'Mashiach b'par, we know the kohen Mashiach brings a par. It's called a par kohen Mashiach. The ein mevi asham tali, and a kohen HaMashiach never brings an asham tali. Ma tzibur einay chayiv el al helam davar. Just like the tzibur is only chayiv their special par if there was a helam davar im shugas ma'isa, if there was first a psak that preceded the action, af Mashiach lo yehi chayiv el al helam davar im shugas ma'isa. So that's one way you can go. So again, the two similarities that and this is important, the two similarities that the Bryce is identifying between the Par HaMashiach and the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibur is that just like a Tzibur brings a par the Kohen Mashiach brings a par. That's a strong similarity. And the second strong similarity is just like a tzibur does not bring an Asham Talui, so too a Kohen HaMashiach doesn't bring an Asham Talui. They share all these similarities. Therefore, let's say that the halacha of Helam Dover and Shugas Maisa is also how it works. Or maybe compare it to the Nasi, because I'll show you there's other similarities that are shared between the Kohen HaMashiach and the Nasi. Nasi may be Seira Avoidis Kachavim. When a Nasi does a lever called Avodah Zorah B'Shayik, he'll bring a Seira, and maybe Asham Vadai, and he brings an Asham Vadai in the case where an Asham Vadai is warranted. U'Mashiach may be Seira B'Avodah Kachavim, and a Kohen HaMashiach also, if he has a Shayik in Avodah Zorah, he brings a Seira, and maybe Asham Vadai. And in the scenario that an Asham Vadai was warranted, he would bring an Asham Vadai. So you see there's several similarities between the Kohen Mashiach and the Nasi as well. So let's compare it to a Nasi. Nasi maybe b'shigas ma'isa, even though there's no hell of davar. Af Mashiach should be maybe b'shigas ma'isa, even though there's no hell of davar. Talmud leimer la'ashma sa'am. Harehu Mashiach ketzibur. We treat a par Kohen Mashiach with the same rules as a par helam davar shel tzibur, as far as what triggers it. Ma tzibur eina mevi ela al helam davar im shilas ma'isa. Just like the par helam davar shel tzibur is not triggered unless Bezin first paskins wrongfully, and then that psak is followed by the tzibur. Af Mashiach eina mevi ela al helam davar im shilas ma'isa. So too the Kohen Mashiach will not bring a par unless he first made a psak, a wrongful psak, a mistaken psak, and then he followed on that psak. Frank the Gemara, Amer, let's say another thing. Ma tzibur hayra v'asu acharav v'hayra asoi chayavin. Just like by a tzibur hayra v'asu acharav v'hayra asoi chayavin, af Mashiach k'shehayra v'asu acharav yechayiv. What is this shayla over here? Zok to Gemara. Let's have a quick look at Rashi. Sorry, is Rashi. So Zok to Gemara. Ma tzibur hayra v'asu achav v'rasei chayiv. Just like by a tzibur, if there's a psak of bezin, and then they follow it, they're chayiv. Af Mashiach k'shehayra v'asu achav v'rasei chayiv. Talmud loimer v'hikriv al chatosoi asher chata al mashachata who maybe al mashachatu acher. So the Gemara wants to say, just like by the par helam davar shel tzibur, the posik is Bezdin, and Bezdin does not do the Avera. A third party, Klal shall do the Avera. So maybe that's how it works by Kohen Mashiach. That the Kohen Mashiach didn't do the Avera. Maybe he should have that same similarity that he paskins, and if he paskins and somebody follows his psak wrongfully, that's where you bring a par Kohen HaMashiach. So for that, the pasuk tells us no, that's not a similarity that you should learn from par helam davar shel tzibur, because the pasuk says v'hikriv al chatasoy asher chata. We're talking about an aveir that was done by the Kohen HaMashiach himself. Al mashachata who maybe al mashachatu acher. Mashenkin, but a par helam davar shel tzibur, it's the psak is from Bezdin, but the chet is done by acher. Zok to Gemara, Amar Mar. When we are looking for similarities between the par Kohen Mashiach and the par helam davar shel tzibur, to say that we should naturally, without a pasuk, compare the Kohen Mashiach to the par helam davar, this is what the Brisa quoted as a taina. Amar Mar, Mashiach bepar ve'ein maybe asham tali. Just like a Kohen Mashiach brings a par and doesn't bring an asham tali, so too the tzibur as well. Their carbon is a par helam davar shel tzibur, and a tzibur never brings an asham tali. So that was a comparison. The problem with that comparison is minale they may be asham tali. How do we know that a Kohen Mashiach doesn't bring an asham tali? Zok to Gemara, I'll tell you how I know. Dichsiv, it says by an asham tali. It says by a Kohen. By an asham tali. It says v'chibur alav a Kohen al shigagasoi asher shaga. there's a double lashon shigagosay sheshogag. So the Gemara darshans that lashon, and we darshan misha chatasai v'shigagosay shava. The only type of person who brings a carbon asham talui is someone who is chatas and shogig is the same, meaning it's done without a Horios bezdin prior to it. It's done with a shigugas ma'aseh by itself. Only such a person will bring a nasham tali. Yotze Mashiach she'ein shigugasoi v'chatasoi shava. But a Cohen Mashiach, he doesn't bring a carbon for a shogig if the shigugas ma'aseh. He needed a psak before. Dichsiv la'ashmas ha'om. And the Ashmas tells us that Arehu Mashiach Hitzibur. So we have a major problem over here because we're putting the chicken before the egg or the cart before the horse. Why? Because the only way you know that a Kohen HaMashiach does not bring a Nasham Talui is because we know that he needs first a Hayrah and then a Shiggas Maisa. Where do we know that? From the pasuk of La'ashmas Ha'om. The Brisa was speculating, what if we didn't have La'ashmas Ha'om? Could we have learned the Kohen HaMashiach from the Param Dovashal Tzibur? And what was one of the similarities we wanted to state that they had was that they both don't bring a Nashim Tali. But we don't know that a Kohen HaMashiach doesn't bring a Nashim Tali only after we have already established the fact that he first needs a psak. He needs first the Horios Tos and then the Shiggas Maisa. So the whole taina that the Brisa used, Asham Tolui, as one of the features that you could compare Kohen and Mashiach to a Tzibur to is not valid before we have first established that the Kohen HaMashiach needs to first have a Horios. So therefore that's not a good taina. So what's pshat in the Brisa? So let's see the Gemara again. Omar Mar. Mashiach Bapar, maybe Asham Talui. How do you know that a Kohen Mashiach doesn't bring an Asham Talui? Minolay de maybe Asham Talui. Meaning there's just a Shiggas Maisa and there's no Hira beforehand. Yotze Mashiach she'ein Shiggasoi v'chatasei shava. How do we know that? We only know that after we've established the Ksiv la'ashmas ha'am, after we have la'ashmas ha'am to tell us that. Hareyu Mashiach Ketzibor la'ashmas ha'am. Zoktimor al karchach le'kamalei el asham kedinasva. So al karchach, you have to say that when the Brisa was discussing the similarities between Cohen and Mashiach and the Parhel Bavashal Tzibor, the only similarity that's really valid is that they're both being a par, not the fact that the Kohen HaMashiach does not bring a Nashim Tali, because we don't even know that information until we establish first the pasuk of La'ashmas Ha'am. Okay, gewaltig. So the bottom line that we just need to extract from this Gemara is that the rules of the Par Kohen HaMashiach mirror the rules of a Par Helam Dovashal Tzibur, except for one point. So Lagabi, what are they doing to each other? They're doing to each other that you need first Shigugas, first you need Horios Betos, and then the Shigugas Maisa. That's one thing you know from it. We also know as a byproduct of that is that a Par Kohen Mashiach or a Kohen Mashiach will never bring a Nashim Tali, and we also know that the difference between a Kohen Mashiach and the Par Shal Tzibur is that by the Kohen Mashiach, the person who made the mistake in Eirah was the one who did the Aveira. The mistake was made by Bezdin, but the Aveira was done by the Yachid. Seems like a very simple case. He passed it wrong, he did it, so he brings a carbon. But there's more to it, as Rashi teaches us. There's more to this case. But there's something else. There was another incident happening in Klal Yisrael simultaneously while this happened. And what does it mean? Going to Moiru betray Yisurei. The Kohen paskin for himself that dam is mutter. Rashi says different. The Kohen got a paskin for himself about a certain avodah zarah that it's mutter, and simultaneously while he paskin that and did avodah zarah, the main Sanhedrin paskined something about chaylev was mutter and Klal Yisrael was over chaylev. So there's two stories that are happening on their own. But what's important to note is at the same time that his Cohen Mashiach was triggered, that his power was triggered, there was a public par helam davish al tzibur triggered at the same time. So can he get away? Can he get away with the communal power, or does he still have to bring his own power? So he has to bring his own power. But well, probably because it's segueing into the next case. The next case is if, let's say, he paskined about a certain chaylev that's mutter, and Bezin paskined about that chaylev that was mutter, and then he ate and the tzibur ate. So now they've acted on the same thing. Well, then mischaper lo ima tzibur. There he doesn't have to bring a separate par kohen Mashiach. There he's part of the tzibur. She'ein Bezdin chayovin achiyoru. Okay, another rule that applies by Kohen Mashiach, because we learn it from we already learned this in the first parak, that if they totally delist a complete Isser in the Torah, there's no such thing as Shabbos, there's no such thing as Chaylev, no such thing as Nida, that would not trigger a power of Shal Tzibur, because we don't consider that a legitimate pshat, a legitimate psak, because Zil Kar Beirav, any little child could tell you about these Isurim. The only type of Isurim that if Bezin was matir, and then Klal Yisrael followed, it would trigger such a carbon, would be if it's Levatal Miktas or Lakai Miktas, and there's another rule that has to be something that Tzedokim would have argued with. V'chein HaMashiach, the same halacha applies to a par kohen Mashiach. V'loi ba'avodas kechavim ad sheyoru Levatal Miktas or Lakai Miktas. Avodas kechavim is put into a separate category from par helam shel tzibur, because by the avodas kechavim, there's not only a par brat, but there's a seir brat as well. So that's why the Mishnah discusses its halachas separately. How do we know this halacha? The Tanu Rabbanan. Hayra imatzibur, but also imatzibur. Yachol yafi par la'atzmai. You might think he should have to bring his own independent power for his own issue, even though it was together with the tzibur vidinu. And there's actually a good argument to make to support that. Because Nasi moitze michlal yachid, and Nasi has different halachas than the yachid. Umashiach moitze michlal yachid, and the Kohen HaMashiach is different than the yachid. Like for instance, Nasi is moitze michlal yachid. He brings a different type of carbon chatas, and Mashiach brings a different type of carbon chatas. Ma Nasi chet b'fnei atzmai, maybe b'fnei atzmai. Just like a Nasi, if he did an avera by himself, he has to bring a carbon chatas by himself. But if his aver was done together with the tzibur because of a halama, then then the nasi would not have to bring his own independent carbon. He would just blend it with the tzibur. So maybe af Mashiach chata b'fnei atzmai, maybe b'fnei atzmai chata matzibur mischaper loy imatzibur. Oh, so forget it. It's not a tiny. It's a svara. The same way by a nasi we see that he could be mischaber with the tzibur when he did an aver with the tzibur. So to the Kohen HaMashiach, if he did the aver together with the tzibur, then he could be yotze with the carbon of the tzibur. Zaktimur lo yemamrit b'nasi, but maybe we can't learn this from nasi because nasi is different. Shekein mischaper lo ima tzibur b'yom HaKippurim. There's no special carbon for the nasi on Yom Kippur. The nasi is considered part of the Klal Yisrael, and whatever karbanos are mechaper on all of Klal Yisrael will be mechaper on the nasi. So you see, the nasi is more included in the karbanos, in the kaparas of Klal Yisrael. Tamir b'Mashiach, that he's not included in the regular kapar of Klal Yisrael. There's a special karban. There's a special set of karbanos for the kohanim. Tamir b'Mashiach she'ein mischaper loy ima tzibur b'yom HaKippurim. So once you see they're sort of removed from the kapara of the general population, maybe we should say, maybe even if he's part of a par shel tzibur, he would still have to bring his own par. If he made a chet by himself, then maybe then he brings his own par kohen Mashiach. But if his chet was with the tzibur, mischaper lo ima tzibur. So we learned that from Al Chatosa Asher Chata. Only if he did his own exclusive avera, there does he have to bring a par kohen Mashiach. But if he didn't do his own exclusive avera, he could be included in the carbon of the tzibur, the par helam davar. Let's try to analyze exactly what happened. He paskined and Bezdin paskined, they did together. What exactly happened over here? If the Cohen Psak was a Cohen Gadol who was a mufla, he was an elder, he knew Psak Klor, he was the biggest authority on Psak, but the Bezdin weren't such a choshev Bezdin. Well, then Pshita de miskaperloi b'fnei atzmai. Of course, he's mechaperloi b'fnei atzmai because hayra the lahain v'loi klum. The hayra of a bezdin that have no mufloin, they're not even a valid bezdin to begin with, and even the tzibur wouldn't bring a par helam davar. Uvoy asuya kasboy sira kol chad v'chad, and since they don't qualify as a bezdin, therefore every individual would have had to bring a carbon for that avera that was done. And if you want to learn that the bezdin was a legitimate bezdin, but he wasn't legitimate, well then then he shouldn't bring a par kohen Mashiach because we know that a kohen Mashiach will not bring the par unless there was a legitimate hayra that he made. But it's not considered a legitimate hayra that he made if he's not a mufla. So where is it relevant where they could possibly both have an individual chiyuv where we're discussing if we would combine those chiyuvim? Zok to Gemara. Omar, Rav Papa, I'll tell you what the case is. Very simple. The Bezdin was legit and he was legit. So there's two legitimate Piskei Halacha coming down to be matter something. And then all of Klashol, together with the Kohen Mashiach, violated by following that psak. That's where there's a discussion, should he be joined in with them or not? Zok to Gemara. Savar Abai Lamemar, Chata b'fnei atzmai, v'asna b'fnei atzmai, heichidami. What would be the case? The Yosy b'shnei mekaymos. These two occurrences happened in two separate places. The Chamoiru b'trei Yisurei. So the Kohen Gadol was in Yerushalayim, and he paskined on a certain type of chayla that it's mutter to eat. There was a bezdin sitting in Tveria, and they paskined on Avodah Kachavim that they could do, and everybody followed. That's how Abai thought. Prat our Mishnah is when it's higher betray Yisuri. Amr leRava, no. Atu Shnei Mekaymis Garmin. What does it have to do whether they're in the same place or not? Elafilu Yasi b'chad Mokim. Even if they're both sitting in Yerushalayim, and in Yerushalayim, v'chivin the Kamoy betray Yisuri, and the Sanhedrin paskined on Chaylev, and the Kohen HaMashiach paskined on Avodah Kachavim, that's called Chata b'fnei atzmahu, and Avada, he would bring his own carbon in such a case, even if they were in the same place, because it's a different halacha, it's a different avera that they're talking about. Okay, so what we learn from our Mishnah is that the Kohen HaMashiach will join in with the par helam davar shel tzibur if it was Bezdin who paskined and he paskined on the same halacha and they did it all together. That's when he joins with them. But if it's a different halacha that Klal Yisrael is bringing their power for, he can't tap in to their power. He has to bring his own. Zok Gemara Pshita, and we're going to go through a series of shilas that we had in the first parak regarding being mitzaref miyutim of Klal Yisrael to a roiv to trigger a carbon par helam davar shel tzibur. So Pshita hu bechelev. Let's say his psak and his aver was in chelev v'hein ba'avodas kachavim. So that's clearly chet b'fnei atzmai. It's a completely different avera. The chalukin b'temayu. There's two different isurim. The isur of avodah zarah and the isur of chaylev are two separate isurim, two separate psukim to talk about each of those isurim. And v'chalukin b'karbanos. And avodah zarah has a different carbon from the kapara of chaylev. The hu b'par, he just brings a par. Vein b'par v'seir, because we know when there's an avodah zarah involved, it's a par and a seir. The hakamaisi hani seir v'hu like kamaisi. So therefore, he shouldn't be able to join with them because his carbon does not have as much as they have. The kol shekain hu b'avodas carbon vein b'chelev the chalukim the carbon the same lagamri to hu seira the in hu par. Surely, if he was over avodah zarah, which would have required him to bring a seira, and they are bringing a par, there's two different karbonos. See, in the other way around, where he's bringing a par and they're bringing a par v'seir, included in what they're bringing is a par as well. So maybe there you would say that they could join and they can't. But kol shekein, if there's two completely separate karbanos that they have, he can't be yoytze with their carbon. It's the wrong carbon. But how about if they were more similar? These are two different halachas, but they're still the same isser. There's two different psukim where we learn these two chalevs from, but they still are the same type of isser. Now, can you say there it's combined? Mi'armin afagav the karbonon shava, kiven the mitrei krai kaasi, but hapligi b'tamayu, because they are still two separate psukim. Oidilma shem chalev echad, since it's both the same avera, we could combine them, and he could be yoytz with them. How about who bechelev hein bedam? Now, mi'armin b'tamayu hapligin, they're talking two different isurin, and therefore he shouldn't be able to join with them. Oidilma kiven the shavin b'karbon, since they both have the same kapara, and they're now bringing a par helam davar, maybe he could join with them. Bas or carbon aslinon zok gemara take. Rashi raises an important point. The point that Rashi raises is chelev is a deraisa, and there's no mokim to argue as to whether or not there would be a chiyuv on chelev. So that's called zil karaberav. So this is something that you shouldn't even bring a par helam davar shel tzibur for, because if they're passing that this chelev is mutter, that's not considered a legitimate psak. So that's what Rashi raises over here. So Rashi says either the haru bechelev shel akerev ben kezayis lepachos mikazayis. Maybe they were matter even a pachos mikazayis. Could be that's what the shaila was. So Rashi offers solutions where the type of isra that they're being matter by mistake was something that the tzedukah would have argued on. So therefore, it's an area of controversy, and that's where this would be relevant. But if it's an often grew up saying that chalev is mutter, that we learned wouldn't be considered a valid psak, it wouldn't trigger a par helam davar shel tzibur.
Isn't it also a question, can there be a shaila? It's not clearly defined exactly what chalev is, right? So,
that was the other pshat in Rashi.
And how far does it extend exactly? Like
so
this.
Let me see Rashi inside, because that might address what you're mentioning. Who bechelev amachasas akerev ta'avadavar she'ena tzedukim moed. Chelev amachasas akerev, the tzedukim are not moed to. You know why? The loy mifarish kramayniu. The Torah doesn't specifically say what that is. So exactly what David's saying, that we could be talking about a certain type of chelev, how far down the body does the chelev extend, until where is the chelev, and where exactly that chelev is. That's also would be considered a legitimate psak. There's even the machlekes amiroyim as to how far the chelev goes and what's the chelev. So clearly that would be something that's ein tzedukah moed, and clearly that's something that would warrant a psak bezin, so it would be valid. Ma'niu keresh apnimi. Chelev shal gabi adakim shein tzedukah moedim the lakas abhedya that's only learned out of a limud. So that's what they would say. Another pshat is that they were talking about the shiur. And the same thing with all the other aveiros that we're discussing here. Rashi explains it in such a way where it was something that Bezdin would have to make a ruling on, and there wasn't something that would be simple. She'ein Bezdin chayavin at sheyoyru levatal miktas ulakayim miktas. Minolon the at sheyoyru levatal miktas ulakayim miktas. How do you know that that's halacha? Now we already learned in the first parak. Kedamin b'dich perkin. We already learned this in the first parak. It says v'nelam davar, and the mem of v'nelam is connected to the word davar. V'nelam mi davar v'loy chalagu. V'cheina Mashiach minolan. How do you know that the par Cohen Mashiach also has this rule? At shiyoru levatal miktas ulakayim miktas. L'chsiv la'ashmas am harei Mashiach tetzibur. La'ashmas am teaches us that the halachas that apply to it par helam shel tzibur equally apply to par Cohen Mashiach. But loy b'avodas kachavim, minolan. How do we know this? The Tanu Rabbanan l'bishayatza avodas kachavim lidayin ba'atzma. Avodas kachavim is not in the category of all of the other aveiros because it needs a separate carbon. It needs a par and a seir, not just a par. So maybe it shouldn't follow all the other rules of a par helam davar shel tzibur, like v'nelam davar v'loy chalaguf. Maybe it wouldn't be restricted by that, which only applies to a regular par helam davar shel tzibur. There it is. We have Xer Shava. Nemar Kadme Ene in the Parsha of Vodazara. V'nemar Lahalme Ene in the Parsha of Parhalam Dovar. Malalon Bevezin of Kanami Bevezdin. Umalalon Dovar V'loy Chalaguf of Kanami Dovar V'loy Chalaguf. In either case, you need Bezdin the Paskin wrongfully, and then Klal Yisrael follow. And you also need that Bezdin wasn't oiker the whole mitzvah; they were just oiker part of the mitzvah, and that's what would trigger. Zok to Gemara weiter. Ein chayoven el al helm davar im shigulas ma'isa. The chiv is only helm davar and shigulas ma'isa. That's the halacha by a par al shel tzibur, the chayna Mashiach, and that halacha applies equally to the par kohen Mashiach. V'loy b'avodas kachavim, and the same thing by avodas zara. Ein chayoven el al helm davar al shigulas ma'isa. And of course, the Mashiach, the kohen Mashiach has the same halacha. Zok to Gemara minolam. How do we know this? The Tanur Rabbanan. Yishku. If they made a shog yachol yuchayavin al shugas ma'isa, you might think that Klal Yisrael would be chayav apar helam dover, even for a shugas ma'isa without oiros bezdin. Tabadomer yishku v'nelam dover ein chayavin el al helam dover shugas ma'isa. The par helam dover shel tzibur is only triggered if there is first a psak bezdin, and after that it's followed by an action that was done by Klal Yisrael. V'cheina Mashiach minolam. Very easy Gemara, because all of the halachas of Par Helam Dover that we're applying to Cohen Mashiach, we're using the same limud to teach us that La'ashmas Om. The Torah tells us that the Par Cohen Mashiach has the same halachas as the Par Helam Dover. Ella al Helam Dover im Shugas Ma'isa. How do you know this halacha by avodas kachavim? The Tanur Rabbanan. The Torah discussed avodas kachavim separately with the Shabbat Korban. Yochel yuchayavin al shugas ha'maisa. Nemer kan me'enei. V'nemer lahala me'enei. This is a repeat of what the Mishnah tells us. Ma la'alon ein chayavin el al helam davar im shugas ma'isa. By a standard par helam davar, it requires the helam davar first, and then the shugas ma'isa. Af kan me'avodas zara ein chayavin el al helam davar im shugas ma'isa. Frank Gemara, v'ilu Mashiach ba'avodas kachavim loikatani. Look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, "Ein chayavin el al helm davar b'shugas ma'isa," by a regular aveira, of course, v'cheina Mashiach. And then when the Mishnah addresses avodas kachavim, it says, "V'loy b'avodas kachavim ein chayavin el helm davar b'shugas ma'isa," and it doesn't say over here v'cheina Mashiach. Why doesn't it compare the par kohen Mashiach, the carbon that a kohen Mashiach will bring, l'gabi the carbon of avodas zara? So Zok Gemara, it seems like v'ilo Mashiach b'avodas kachavim l'katani masnis and mani. Who is our Mishnah following? Who is the Manda Amar in our Mishnah? Zog to Gemara, Rebbe he eats Rebbe. The Tanya we learned, Mashiach ba'avodas kachavim, a kohen Mashiach who did avodas zara. What's the halacha? Rebbe omer b'shugas ma'isa. Rebbe holds the fact it doesn't need to be hayra. This that the par kohen Mashiach is similar to the par al shel tzibur, that's only legabe other averos of chayv krisos. But the gabe avodas zara, he's like anybody else. If he deans avodas zara by mistake, even though he didn't do any psak before, he'll be chayiv the carbon of avodas zara. Behelam davar, you need the same rules that you need for any other halama. But the shavan shebeseira, everybody agrees that the carbon that would be brought by the kohen Mashiach would be a seira. The shavan she'ein maybe asham tali, and they also both agree that a kohen Mashiach does not bring an asham tali. We've already discussed that on Omar Aleph. Frank Gemara v'tizbara. Are you saying that? I don't understand. Does it say anywhere about a kohen Mashiach that it only applies to a carbon that's doine karos shugas chatas? Now, in the Mishnah later on Daf Ches Amud Aleph, the Mishnah is telling us the rules of par helam davar shel tzibur, and one of the rules is it's only for an aveira that would be bizdoine karos uvishugas chatas. That's one of the rules. And there it doesn't either say v'chein HaMashiach. And for sure that applies to a par kohen HaMashiach. So the kasha is, just because it doesn't say v'chein HaMashiach over here in our Mishnah by avodas zara, who said you should make hay out of it? And who said you should be medayek that, by a kohen it must be different? Clearly everybody holds the iser of a par kohen Mashiach is only in the davar shezoyin karos and shugos chatas. But if you look at the next Mishnah on Ches, it doesn't say v'chein HaMashiach there either. So, Frank the Marva, Tizbar, Bizdoine Kars, Vishugas Achatas, Mikatani, Elatani Ha, Vodin Law. The Mishnah understands, we've already said several times, V'chein Mashiach, so the Tana doesn't keep on repeating that, because the Tana assumes you got the message that all of the halachas that we're going to talk about for a carbon tzibur will apply to a par kohen Mashiach. Hakanami, when it comes to avodah zarah over here as well, Tana ha v'adin laha. Okay, that was as far as they're above. So, for example, my time with the Rebbe, but why does Rebbe hold that by kohen gadol with avodah zarah it doesn't follow the rules of the rest of Klal Yisrael that there has to be a hayrah first? Rather, it's like a regular chatas. So, tomorrow because Omer Kra v'chibur hakoyin ala nefesh asher geges. Let's look at the whole pasuk so I read it properly. It says v'chibur hakoyin ala nefesh asher geges b'cheta b'shkoga l'fnei Hashem l'chaper lov v'nislach loy. The Zok to Gemara, let's dash in this pasuk. V'chibur hakoyin ala nefesh asher geges b'cheta b'shkoga ha nefesh. What do you mean the koyin's b'chaper on the nefesh? Ha nefesh ze Mashiach. That's referring to his kapara that is being mechaber kohen Mashiach. Hashageges, then zenosi. When it says hashageges, that's referring to a nosi. Bechata b'shkaga, what does that refer to? Rabbi Savar chet ze b'shkaga yehi. This chet should be like a regular shogeg, meaning even if it did not have a psak first. Rabban Savri no. Misha chatazai b'shkaga davka, someone whose chatas is b'shogeg yotze Mashiach she'ein chatasa b'shkaga ela b'helam davar. So this pasuk is talking about a standard chatas. Rabbi learns it even includes a kohen Mashiach who did the avera of avodah zarah, that without any helam davar, he just did the avera with shilgas ma'isa, he would be chayiv. The Rabbanan learn no. This is a korban chatas that only apply to someone who has only to someone who could bring a chatas in a case where there was no psak before. That only applies to a yochid. Misha chatasi b'shkaga. A regular yochid, if he does an aver b'shogeg without any psak, meaning he ate chayla thinking he was shuman, he brings a korban. A kohen Mashiach would not bring a chatas for that. Yotze Mashiach she'ein chatasi b'shkaga ela b'helam davar. And that's an important thing that I should have pointed out beferish, that this par kohen HaMashiach that he brings, if he passed in wrong, that's the only korban he brings. If a kohen stam is over on chaylev because he ate chaylev thinking that it was shuman, he doesn't bring any korban at all. The only korban chatas that a kohen brings is only the par kohen HaMashiach. He is not in the parsha of the regular korban chatas of everybody else. So therefore, the Rabbanan could learn. You know who gets this kapara? Mishachatase b'shkaga. Only somebody who has the standard korban chatos of an avera that he does b'shogeg. Yotze Mashiach she'ein chatase b'shkaga elam davar. A kohen Mashiach never brings a korban chatos. The only korban he brings is a helam davar korban, which is a par kohen Mashiach. V'shavan shebeseir kiyachid. Everybody holds they bring a seira for avodah zarah minolan. How do you know this? Tamakra v'nefesh achas. And we learn what's nefesh achas. Echad yochid ve'echad nasi. Any individual, it doesn't make a difference if he's a private citizen. It doesn't matter if he's a nasi ve'echad Mashiach or if he's the kind of Mashiach. Either way, we consider him a yochid. Kulam b'chlal nefesh achasein, and therefore they all bring the same korban for avodah zarah. Okay, let's stop here.